My name is Daniela Gabor. I am a professor of economics and macrofinance at the University of the West of England in Bristol. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce both the conference and the keynote speaker. And let me start by saying that this is the 30 years of capitalist transformations in Central and Eastern Europe conference, looking at inequalities and social resistance, organized by the Institute for Social Solidarity and the Faculty of Sociology and Social Work at the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca in Romania. And as you might have noticed by looking at the program, this promises to be a really exciting and excellent conference, not one of those killed by Zoom online conferences, but an amazing lineup in the program, both in terms of participants and issues that will be explored. The organizers tell me that we have around 650 participants registered online to attend, and I'm sure they will be as excited as me by both the keynote speakers that the organizers have lined up, and congratulations for the amazing work that they have done in putting together this conference, but also by the topics that will be explored. I am going to pass the word to Christina Ratz, who's the head of the Department of Sociology and Social Work at Babeș-Bolyai, and then I'll come back and introduce Dorothee Bohle, and then we will have the great pleasure of listening to her remarks, and then we'll come back and have an interesting discussion, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. Before giving you some warm welcome words to the Sociology Department of the Faculty of Sociology and Social Work at the Babeș-Bolyai University, I would just like to draw your attention to the small announcement on your chat box concerning the fact that if you experience any technical difficulties, feel free to move on the YouTube channel of the faculty. The link is given in the box, so that you can listen to this in a different online platform. So I would start by saying that this conference is a statement that social science scholarship in the region and about the region of Central and Eastern Europe has already left behind a narrow vision of transitology that univocally and uncritically praises the embarking of post-communist countries on the road to capitalism, and if they were intrinsically linked to democracy. Instead, social science scholarship turned towards a critical understanding and an engaged analysis of the manifold transformations that led to deep inequalities, precarization, a new wave of racism, xenophobia, sexism, ecological disaster, and the undermining of democratic values that we aspired for back in '89. So this scholarship builds on a Marxist tradition to reveal structural injustice, commodification, and exploitation, a Weberian critique of instrumental rationality and bureaucracy, and the Polanyian understanding of the embeddedness of the economy in the social. It looks at the region from a broader historical perspective as part of a global nexus, as it was the initial idea of the founders of our university, which was set up from the very beginning as part of a network of universities in the region. And it was also the guiding vision of previous generations of social science scholars in Central and Eastern Europe. So today we make a statement, but we also assume a responsibility for an engaged scholarship that seeks social justice and solidarity and dares to propose real utopias in the sense of the regretted Ellie Collins right. We are here today to strengthen the links that could make such progress and such strengthening of social science in the region possible. So we are very glad that you are here. And before passing the Zoom to Dorothee Bohle, I would just like to say two brief sentences of acknowledgement to an incredible organizing team that worked very hard, and a kind request to make their job easy, and a very heartfelt acknowledgement to my colleague Sorin Gog, who should have delivered, I think, this introductory speech, but he vehemently opposed that. So I'm very grateful that we can host this conference, and once again, welcome to the virtual place where in 1909, Polanyi received his doctoral thesis. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and let's also thank Sorin Gog, one of the key drivers and organizers, not only for his work, but also for allowing for an all-women panel to open this conference. It's a great thing to see. So to move to Doro Bohle, I don't think Professor Bohle doesn't need an introduction, but it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome her virtually to this conference. She is I think, one of our most important scholars of Eastern European capitalisms, whose analytical rigorosity and original insights have engaged and infused many interesting and important debates and have enriched our understanding of capitalist diversity in the region. And she'll take the floor now and walk us through what she sees are the interesting challenges to capitalism and the transformations that we are seeing. And then Enrico Vince and myself will respond, and then I will open the floor for comments and questions and hopefully a very lively dialogue. Doro, please.
So let me share my screen. Okay, just give me a sign. Can you see the slides? Okay, perfect. And you hear me well, wonderful. So first of all, thank you very, very much for this invitation and the occasion to basically present what I consider very much work in progress at this amazing conference. So I already told it to Sorin and I will tell it here again. I think it is a milestone in the development of let's say self-awareness of critical political economy in the region, and this conference has attracted so many people and so many interesting papers and conversations that I think we will remember it also as a beginning, as if you want, a critical juncture and a beginning of a new conversation. And I'm very honored to be part of this conversation. I'm also, I have to say, I'm extremely pleased to be invited also by an institute that gave Karl Polanyi his doctorate. Those of you who know my work know that I have been following and been engaging with Karl Polanyi quite a bit, and this is really an honor to come back to the place of origin in many ways. So thank you very much for this, and let me now share my work in progress or my thinking in progress with you, with the hope of a lively conversation afterwards. So basically what I will be presenting today, I have like 3 aims. So the first is to a little bit map the transformations of East European capitalism since the great financial crisis. I mean, we know that a lot has been going on, but there is very different interpretation. How far did it go? And the main question here I will ask is, so how neoliberal is Eastern European capitalism still after the great financial crisis, and how much deviation is there? The second, and also, you know, how I will offer one way of conceptualizing these changes. Then the second aim is to engage with existing literature on the changes, which addresses more 2 questions: the changing nature between political authority and capitalism, and also the social purpose of the recent transformations in capitalism. This is a literature that mostly deals with the Hungarian and sometimes with the Polish case, so it's very much case fixated, but there is it's a cottage industry basically trying to understand what happened to these countries. And I think it carries broader lessons for what happens maybe to the region overall. And I want to, you know, map the debate and see what is the state of the debate. And then finally, the third aim is to identify, or this is what I, by preparing this, what I have identified increasingly, and not only in the scholarship on East Central Europe, but also broader the renewal of comparative political economy scholarship, that I find there is one major blind spot, which I think we as critical scholars need to be addressing much more consciously, and that is that by a more critical political economy, people also return to a vision of capitalism which is based on manufacturing and blue-collar workers and typically male workers. And I think we miss a lot of the transformations of capitalism itself if we don't open up that blind spot. And I want to give some avenues for research by basically engaging more consistently comparative political economy with feminist political economy, if you want. So that's, but these will just be some glimpses in research that I think partly has been done, but it needs to be brought together, but partly also needs still to be done. Okay, so the structure of my talk is very clear. It's basically follows the three aims that I mapped out. I should also, before I forget, I should add one additional thing. So most of this is what I will be presenting is really based on collaborative work. So I've been working with Bela Greszkowicz a lot on this, but also with a team of people here at the EUI and at other universities. So Gerge Metwe-Balint, Vera Stepanovic, Alan Toplešek, Edgars Almanis, Niels Oellerich, Jasper Siemens. So these people who basically have been working with me on more recent changes. So it is my sense making, but it is collaborative work. Okay, so these are the straightforward. The first point that I'm will be talking about is neoliberalism resilient in the region. So how can we make sense of some empirical evidence? Second, how do we conceptualize the new, maybe non-neoliberal, authoritarian, whatever kids on the block? And third, how can we engage with or make productive use of the blind spot, which is basically the gendered nature of authoritarian capitalism or capitalism more general. So, I mean, starting with the great financial crisis, I mean, this is what many scholars, I think, consider a turning point in capitalism. I mean, as I think everybody here is aware, so capitalism in East Central Europe after the transformation was basically built on foreign direct investment, so the dependent market economy, if you want, and a relatively radical neoliberal restructuring. And that has come to some, I mean, there certainly have been some changes since the great financial crisis, because that one marked an end to the FDI boom of the early 2000s. And this you can see here on the graph. Basically, since 2009, FDI, foreign direct investment, is still coming in, but it is coming in at a slower pace, and countries need to work more in order to get FDI in, and there is a declining trend in general. The financial crisis also led to a sudden stop and reversal of capital flows, so it made countries or governments more aware of how vulnerable basically foreign finance is. It subjected some countries to IMF conditionality, including Romania, of course, but Hungary and Latvia. And all of this basically, I think, led to that it channeled existing discontent with neoliberalism and FDI-led growth into political debates about alternatives. And what I want to do is I mean, this is basically how I try to make sense of, if we think about alternatives in terms of policies. So I'm talking here about neoliberal policies, not neoliberalism as a social system, right? So what are the dimensions where we see changes and where we would expect changes? So I do, political scientists like to do this, a 2x2 table. And I think the debates about alternatives or changes evolves around these two dimensions. So the one is what is typically called the left-right dimension in politics or political economy. I normally how this is conceptualized in political economy or political science is it states or markets? I think that's not the right question. It is really the purpose, basically. So the left, and here I follow Norberto Bobbio with his definition of left and right. So the purpose the question is really, the left is characterized by that it wants to use state intervention and others in order to reduce inequality, whereas the right has a tolerance for inequality that can be an inequality based on markets or an inequality based on status. So conservatism is also belongs to the right and accepts inequalities based on status. And then the other dimension, and that I think came really after the great financial crisis, is an increasing challenge of international integration. So the poles are between international integration and national sovereignty. So basically the question behind is, how much should states or governments be able to basically define for themselves the aim of their economic policies, and how much should they accept what comes from the international agencies, of course, like the EU and others. And based on this, we can define 4 broad answers to the crisis. The one is the mainstream neoliberal, which is basically a continuation, so that we keep accepting inequality based on market results, and we keep accepting international integration. This is even a strong part of neoliberalism, as Quinn Slobodian, for instance, has clearly spelled out. And then I don't even go into the left-wing answers because we don't really find them in the region very much. I just go to the nationalist right answer. So that, like, again, a couple of authors like Joachim Becker or Alan Toplicek made clear, it is a curious refashioning of neoliberalism, right? So it's not a break with neoliberalism, and it is not a break with markets in general, but if we think in terms of economic policies, it's a kind of more heterodox, so a mixture of orthodox policies and heterodox policies, like with what happens with central banking, for instance, or monetary policy, or also state intervention. And it often also mixes or adds to the mix socially very conservative welfare state policies. So the main, and just if we look now for Eastern Europe, in my view, or in my interpretation, or however you want to call it, the main debate, if you want, is between mainstream neoliberalism and this nationalist right answer, where there is some continuity with neoliberalism, but there is also an increasing challenge on a number of dimensions that go against the orthodoxy. And of course, the right-wing nationalist right answer very strongly claims national sovereignty, not in the sense of economic nationalism as we know it from the 1930s. No government in the region or elsewhere would ever go that way, but a very selective basically pushing back of international demands, both on the political side but also on the economic side. Now, one of the first things that I think is striking, because we talk so much about Hungary and Poland, but most countries in the region kept, even after the financial crisis and after partly like with the Baltic states, really major crisis, kept the mainstream neoliberal outlook. So that I think is something worth remarking first. And we have some countries, I put them here to the right. I think partly they should be a little bit more here on the more to the left if you want, but still in the more mainstream neoliberal camp. So Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia, they have experimented a little bit with more unorthodox measures from time to time, but it's not very consistent. So the only countries that have really consistently departed from the mainstream neoliberal economic path are Hungary and Poland. And that I think is already a first striking finding. Now, just a very brief glimpse into whether the COVID, we can talk about it in the Q&A. This is too early to tell, but whether this changes the picture a lot, because the COVID crisis is not a financial crisis, it's a very different type of crisis, right? So does it change the picture? And I mean, just very briefly, these are just fiscal responses to the COVID crisis. The distinction is above the line responses means direct spending, and below the line is like guarantees, loans, and so on, so promises in the future. And what we basically see, I think, is two things. So there are 3 countries that have actually, so Western Europe are, if you want, northwestern countries as a comparator, and it's only 2 countries that have actually, no, 3 countries that have kind of been more generous than the West European average. And this is the Czech Republic, which has a very high below the line fiscal commitment. This is Poland, which has a very high above the line. So that is really something to watch. And then Latvia also, that has a very high above the line response. But all the rest of the countries basically stay far below. And this is relational, right? It's percentage of GDP. And you see the Balkan countries have really not reacted strongly at all. So this basically still confirms that we don't have a super big deviation from the neoliberalism as we know it. So let me summarize the first part. Basically, I think why there are important shifts. Those authors, I mean, there are a couple of authors, and I will come to them in the next part of the talk, who see that neoliberalism is over. They overlooked important continuities, and these continuities come in 2 ways. So either the continuity within basically what I call mainstream neoliberal, or as one part of the more heterodox or more combined policy package in the nationalist rights answer. Now, clearly, policies are not all, right? So when we think about the changes since the great financial crisis. So the next step in my, if you want, literature review is more, or engagement with the literature, is to ask, so how does the shift between political authority and the markets or capitalism actually, has it changed, and if so, how? And this is mostly based on the literature that looks at these 2 cases, Hungary and Poland, but mostly really Hungary. I mean, Hungary has attracted a lot of attention, and maybe, I mean, this is something to think whether it has attracted a little bit too much of attention in order to make sense of broader trends in the region. But anyway, so so the second part of my talk is, how do we conceptualize this new kids on the block, and are then how neoliberal or non-neoliberal are there? Sorry, are they? So here is again a 2x2 table. So I think the debate that we see currently in the literature evolves around 2 dimensions. So the first one is, who controls the transformation? So who is in the driving seat in, let's say, Hungarian, Polish, or other more, if you want, authoritarian capitalisms? Is it basically, so you have authors that go into a more materialist or understand it as a more materialist way, that it's the economy that shapes political opportunities, and then maybe political actors take over, but it's basically stemming from the economy? Or is it top down from state actors that basically impose changes, radical changes, partly to the economy? And the second question is, does the transformation that we see serve developmental purposes or not? So is it a return to a new developmentalism, as some authors say, or is it basically rent-seeking, corruption, etc.? And based on this, I think we can, or I mean, the labels can still, they are not, some labels make sense, some labels maybe not entirely, but anyway. So we have one very clear identifiable strand in the literature, which is this authoritarian neoliberalism, which basically argues that authoritarianism currently answers if you want, to the functional needs of neoliberal accumulation, which has somehow come to some standstill and has to be continued. And then we have, as a counterpart, authoritarian capitalism, which basically argues it's a top-down change coming from political elites that capture the state and the economy to foster their own betterment. These literatures basically say the transformation does certainly not serve any kind of developmental purpose. But then we have other literature that actually says, so the Marek Nacek has a recent piece, or I think it's forthcoming now, who argues that it's domestic, for the Polish case, domestic comprador bourgeoisie, this is how he calls it, basically kind of almost captured the state for developmental purposes. So he says he sees a clear developmental agenda. And we have also a number of authors like Katharina Blum and Michael Wager, or Appel and Orenstein, who see a broader new authoritarian developmentalism, again, coming from top down. I will maybe not too long, but walk you a little bit more through some of these literatures, just to basically get the fixed point of the debate, and then different literatures can be put in different boxes. So as I said, I think the authoritarian neoliberalism as Braff and Fabre and others, and partly also Scheiring, he moves a little bit around in these cells, have articulated, has in a way a rather clear and theoretical message. So it is basically what they see as the major change is a reconfiguration of the state in a less democratic entity through constitutional and legal changes that seeks to insulate the state from social and political conflict. So this is what neoliberalism has always done. It has taken out institutions from popular democracy, basically, created non-majoritarian or constitutionalized non-majoritarian through non-majoritarian institutions, an insulated economy. And with the deepening of the crisis of neoliberalism, this has taken new strength. So austerity has been constitutionalized. This is what Braff would say, but then authors working on the region also, and here comes a second strand of this changing boundary of state and market. They also use basically more populist tropes, xenophobia, racism, and so on, in order to gain hegemony or co-opt some parts of the subordinated classes into their project. So the theoretical roots here are Marxist debates about neoliberalism. So Stuart Hall is a very prominent figure, then Nikos Poulantzas, and neoliberalism is seen as a class project. Now, I think the polar opposite on those on the side who see basically the anti-developmentalist deepening or changing of capitalism is those authors, and here I base really on Schalay and Schneider, who talk about authoritarian capitalism. And what they argue is that, that there is a reconfiguration of the two boundaries between the public and private, and these two boundaries are reconfigured by violating the rule of law. And they talk about two principles: the violation of the principle of self-limitation of the state. So state autonomy is being violated, basically. So state, the interference of state in the market is violated. So property rights are being violated, etc. But then there is also violation of state autonomy via elite agency and colonialization of the state. And for these authors, this is a top-down story. So it's really the political elites that basically capture the state and use the state and the economy, state intervention in the economy to foster their private gains. And this is based in a very different approach, so institutionalist approach, like varieties of capitalism, developmental state, and national business systems. And the main thrust of this literature is basically to contrast what is a developmental state, what is a regulatory state, and what is or developmental capitalism, regulatory capitalism, or authoritarian capitalism. And this so state intervention by means which are not really in line with rule of law are basically giving you the authoritarian capitalism. And I think if one in a way, I think in order to understand what's going on, one needs to combine them. So authoritarian neoliberalism, too much is being read into continuity of neoliberalism and not enough what else is there. But authoritarian capitalism, on the other hand, does not really have a theory of capitalism. So that makes that one a little bit tricky. So you don't know what is capitalist about it. But this is just a side remark. Then, as I said, so the other part of the debate or dimension of the debate is the return of the state. Is it a reaction to a developmental impasse or not? And here, a number of authors really see a new developmental agenda emerge. I mean, by the way, this transition report, I don't know if anyone can make sense of this cover. You see the nanny state, which comes back as a socialist nanny state. So this is, and it is really violently striking back. This is really a striking thing. So, but these authors that I quote here basically are not, so they see they see it as a positive connotation, and they see that state power is being used for a new developmental policy agenda. And what I want to stress here only, maybe as an important issue, this has. So for these authors, I think the recent changes, and this is in contrast to the authors, to the authoritarian neoliberalism, but also to authoritarian capitalism literature, there is an implicit normative agenda, or these authors really also welcome these changes, right? So there is a normative agenda behind, I think, for many people to say that because of the predominance of neoliberalism before, the return of the state in principle is a good thing, and it could serve the purpose of developmentalism, and let's see under which conditions does it really happen. Or there is also some kind of understanding, if you read Appel and Orenstein, there is some kind of understanding for Orban and Putin and so on, because, you know, they want to now implement a new developmental agenda. So this normative story behind is very important as well. Let me summarize so again, this second part very briefly. So I think authoritarianism, statism, and developmentalism have been identified as new features of some of East Central Europe's post Great Financial Crisis capitalisms. And what is interesting is that these new features are often analyzed by going back to older paradigms in political economy. So not so much but even Schalay and Schneider, if you think about it, because they engage a lot with the developmental literature, because what they also want to distinguish is a developmental state from basically an authoritarian state or capitalism. But then the Marxists, the revival of reading Stuart Hall and Poulantzas and so on, that of course goes back to a revival of more critical approaches, and also the use of class language and so on. And if we compare it to the comparative paradigms that we have been using before, they were more institutionalist and so on. So there is this revival of critical and developmentalist normative agenda, but I think, and this is really something that I increasingly felt when going through these readings and the literature, and saying that this has really come at a price, namely that the reference point is the word of industrial capitalism, and the heroes are the blue-collar industrial workers. And inevitably, I think this perspective has a lot of blind spots, and we need to think further along these lines. So I mean, the work by, if you take the work by Scharing or Gaberheimer, you have, you know, the text of nation and subtext of class, but class is always identified the blue-collar industrial worker, and they are somehow the real heroes of this new transformation in whichever ways that go. And I think we do need to go beyond that. So I take and this is so what I will be presenting now is really just a couple of glimpses, what I think, what is obvious and what should be also in a comparative way, just be brought into the analysis of capitalism and comparative capitalism for the region. And some of this has been done. So it's not that this has not been done, but the comparative political economy literature does not really talk to the feminist political economy literature very much, and vice versa. And I think that is where things should, be strengthened. So I focus. I mean, there are many blind spots, but that's normal. So I will really focus on the gender, or show through it. Let's put it this way: through a gendered perspective, what are the blind spots that we are currently not very much engaging it? And I draw basically on three. I mean, three. I draw on more literature, but this is they give three aspects. So the one is an article by Valen in Review of International Political Economy, quite some time ago, where she says that the problem even with critical political economy is that they always add women on, so they don't integrate them systematically; they add them on somehow, and they also often think that women are per se emancipatory, which I think is not the case. So the women are just added on, and they are the other, but they are not integrated consistently. Then the book by Gahl and Klickmann, which basically shows through, if one looks at the societies in East Central Europe through a gendered lens, how much of the realm of the transition we see, which we don't see when we just focus on formal institutions and markets and states. And then a recent book by Hosic and True that try to think through the gendered nature and the feminist lessons from the global financial crisis, which is finance is so male, right? But and everybody who interpreted this crisis, I mean, the big books we read is by male authors, but also there is a whole part of the story missing. So let me just see how I think one could, or what are the obvious things where we need to do further research or combine the insights of existing research from different traditions. So the first is, and here I take, I mean, if I think about what authoritarian neoliberalism, so the perspective I outlined, has missed. The first one is, we never talk about about the public sector, apart from saying, yeah, there is a lot of austerity. But what does it really mean, right? If we take a gendered perspective, we would look, for instance, at the care sector, and we would look at what happens to the healthcare sector. And what does the repercussions of a massive exodus of women, qualified women, to the West European healthcare system, what does this mean politically for those who stay behind? So that would be a question to think further. So how does this contribute to hegemony building, to authoritarianism, and so on? And this exit, so the massive exit, and then the political repercussions are rarely conceptualized in the literature, and I think this is something that that is important. And of course, I mean, this is just one example, but taking broader the whole effect of austerity on care work, which has, again, there is a rich literature on this, but to bring this back into the political economy perspective and articulate it would be very important. But there is a second story, and that I find truly, because the care work a lot of people have really been working about, but a second part of if we focus on the public sector rather than on blue collar and manufacturing workers, is also the rise of conservative voice. And here these are two different works. So one is the interesting fact that since 2006, Fidesz has consistently been by far the most popular party of the so-called social professionals. So this comes from the work of one of my doctoral students, and this is so. In the Western literature, normally the social cultural professionals, so these are basically people with higher education who work in the public sector, healthcare, teachers, and so on. They are typically seen as the one who are the cosmopolitan left wings. Right, at least in Hungary, no idea how this is elsewhere, they have aligned the Orbanite camp. So, and again, if you look at the gender lens, this is, here you have an overrepresentation of female voices, and this is a conservative voice. And on the right side, and this comes from the research of Bela Grešković on the civic circles, which is a civil society movement, a conservative civil society movement that basically was developed top down, but also did a bit bottom up from the 2000s in order to provide an underbelly of hegemony for Fidesz in Hungary. So there was a strong protest against the educational measures of public education in Hungary that in the early 2000s, and you have all the tropes of a conservative criticism of neoliberalism, right? So it's a Polanyian conservative counter movement. So if we have the exit and the conservative voice in the, if you look at the public sector, it changes a little bit who are the main actors basically in the current transformation. Okay, let me also go then, if I think about the agenda of the authoritarian capitalism literature, how can we enlarge the framework? Because what they are currently looking is the relationship between state and markets. Now, I already showed with the previous slide when the civic circles, if we have a broader understanding of the shifting boundaries between the public and the private, we can have a look at how the state penetrates civil society from above rather than civil society building from below. This is again the work on civic circles that in Hungary has happened I mean, at an important scale. So we see how hegemony is being created in authoritarianism through penetration of civil society, and civil society is not only the place of resistance. And then, of course, I mean, this is clearly I mean, where feminist feminist scholarship has so much to contribute. The whole sphere of reproduction is left out by authoritarian capitalism, and if we look into this, we get a really fuller understanding of the transformation. So let me again just give you two examples where work has been done, but more work needs to be done. So the one is if we look at the authoritarian capitalism through a gender lens. If we look at housing, which is crucial, and it's a crucial dimension of capitalism, I mean, the great financial crisis was, of course, I mean, it had a lot to do with housing, and housing is the sphere also of social reproduction. Now, let me just take the Orban story. So this fight against debt slavery focused initially on breaking the links between housing and financial markets, right, and bringing the state back in. And many scholars, actually including myself, think what happened in the sphere of definancialization of housing in Hungary was actually not the worst thing to happen, because, I mean, definancialization is a good thing. But if we only look at it this way, we miss how increasing state dependency of housing also leads to deeply, I mean, a restructuring of reproductive choices of housing and of households and of women. So so the whole new housing policy in Hungary has an incredibly familiaristic or natalistic dimension, which is also linked to the return of the state. So we get basically, you know, from a very highly financialized housing sector to one which basically forces people in Hungary to build families in order to have access to houses and have income. So this is another example. And the final one, this is something I take from recent work by Eva Fodor, because we often talk, when we think about authoritarian, or when we think about deepening of neoliberalism or also authoritarian capitalism, we think about workfare. We rarely think about what she calls carefare. And this is something she did on deep work on Hungary, but I think this should be also used as to broaden it in a comparative lens. So what she understands as carefare is a solution to the care crisis, the crisis of care, because clearly the state doesn't. I mean, none of the under neoliberalism, the public investment in care was retrenched, and so the Orban government, how it sought to solve it, is by creating this carefare regime, which is characterized by the fact that women's claims to social citizenship are now most successfully made based on doing care work rather than being a citizen, or rather than being a worker. But also women have to combine, so they have to do care work and they have to be wage workers. So that is something that is often overlooked when we think about conservative welfare states. The labor market activation for women has been a very important part of it. Equal pay not, and the Ministry let me see, one of the ministries even said very publicly, there is no need for women to be paid equally to men. No, it's important that they work. So they have to double, they have to work wage work, and they have to do the care work. You also have a re-engineering of the welfare state. Churches, so very, very conservative churches, go in, take over schools and so on. So there is also an ideological refashioning of the agenda, and this is all accompanied by a shrill anti-gender discourse that serves to legitimate the unequal gender order that is emerging in Hungary. So the carefare is an important part of this new capitalism that we see emerging in Hungary, and it is more than we usually think. I mean, at least the political economy part where I come from normally thinks about, namely thinking in terms of traditional welfare state and putting women back into the kitchen. It's not happening. It's a new. It's basically women as individuals and with social citizenship rights cease to exist. They start to have rights through their integration or through doing family work. So this is the restructuring on that point. Okay, with this I come to my conclusions. So I will just stress three things. So first, despite two major crises, neoliberalism has been surprisingly resilient in the region. And let me also stress, most of it is not explicitly authoritarian in the sense that the state needs to also massively invest in hegemony building through xenophobia and so on and so on. Some of it is, but so this mainstream neoliberalism is quite resilient, and that I find a first surprising thing. And then my second point was that while authoritarianism, statism, and developmentism have been rightly recognized as the new features of some of the new capitalisms, the focus on the word of industrial capitalism makes it blind to more encompassing transformations. And therefore, I do think that comparative capitalism research needs to engage systematically with the insights of feminist scholarship. A gender perspective puts as its core the changing boundaries between public and private, and this way it can shed light on encompassing social transformations and the complicated mechanisms of authoritarianism, co-optation, and resistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Doro, sorry, for this excellent intervention. Let's start with Enika, please, and then I'll make a couple of remarks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, for being a discussant. on this great challenging introduction to our conference. Yeah, and the big interest towards the conference shows that there is a lack of knowledge and communication about capitalist transformations from the perspective of Central and Eastern European peripheries. So this conference fills some gaps in that. And I'm even more satisfied that the initiative for such a conference came from Romania, where we still have intellectuals who are very hesitant even to use the term capitalism. I don't know, supposing that this is a kind of natural state of Romanianness, or a natural, I don't know, victory resulting from the war against communism. So thank you, Doro, for the very, very large flame that you opened for all of us. I'm sure that for the next 3 days, people will refer to your presentation. I have chosen a particular way to discuss your presentation, and that is to formulate some complementary perspectives, ideas, and questions to your topic, and to end with some conclusions, which I hope that is actually or are actually part of a political economy perspective on the subject of our conference. So first, let me formulate some further principles that might guide us in our analysis. Yeah, but I don't know why I'm blocked. Sorry. Maybe I have to stop sharing and share it again. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties.
I think if you use page down, it normally works.
Yes, it works normally. Yeah. So the first principle that I would like to put on the table is to address the stage of post-Great Financial Crisis capitalism in the region into the larger history of its 30 years of capitalist transformations. And this is about addressing again one of the great transformations of the 20th century, which is the transformation of state socialism, or really existing socialism, into neoliberal capitalism. A second principle that I would like to formulate here, it is the need to address Central and East European capitalist transformations as integral part of the longue durée transformations of global capitalism. This is about asking about the role of Central European semi-peripheries on the global stage of capitalism as instrument for the spatial fix of global capital. A further principle that I would like to recall here, and I'm sure that everybody knows, but just not to forget about it, that when we are talking about capitalist transformations, we should not forget that the history of capitalism is a history of its series of cyclical crises. So how the way how a crisis is solved creates the conditions of possibility for the outbreak of the next crisis. And the solutions found to particular crises are based on the political will to keep capitalism going, which is to create new opportunities for capital investment and to assure profitability. Last but not least, there is this principle according to which in different stages of capitalism, the state supported the recovery and profitability of the capital. The difference between these stages was actually about how far did the state go in the support of labor force. This depended on the degree to which the labor force was useful for profit making. Some complementary ideas about what we do know about the the last financial crisis. Michael Roberts says that actually what happened from 2009 until today is actually a long depression, because even if there was a slow recovery, economically speaking, from the Great Recession, this economic recovery was slow. salaries were kept low, productivity in productive sectors remained low, employment rates did not increase enough. And in parallel with this, as we know, there was injected a lot of public money into the banking system, and there was a new boom of the stock and bond market. And in parallel with this, bank interest rates were reduced to support further loans, which increased the corporate indebtedness. In Central and East European region, this crisis was and is still used today to further erode the social state, to reduce public investment into public services, to justify austerity measures, and at the end of the day, to increase the indebtedness of households. This crisis meant for Central and Eastern European countries the continuous privatization of what was left in state ownership, most importantly the productive companies, but as well as sectors with social roles such as housing, school education, healthcare, social protection. And what we also did have was the liberalization of energy market, which had a great contribution to increasing costs of life without an adequate raise of salaries. So the region remained an area of cheap labor force on the stage of global capitalism. Just a few points which are more directly linked to the 3 points analysis of Dorothee. The first point regarding foreign direct investments, I just want to formulate here a question. What does the FDI inflow reflect about the changing attitudes of international financial organizations towards Central and Eastern European countries? Because we remember that from the beginning after 1990, we heard from IMF and from the World Bank that it is foreign direct investment that are going to save us. And actually, we were ranked in a hierarchy according to our usefulness in the process of spatial fix. The second point of Dorothee's analysis about the features of the post-GFC capitalism, we heard about them. I want to ask, related to these features, how far are them present in non-CEE countries, and in particular in the countries of advanced capitalism? I'm asking this because I think that we should address this question in order to avoid the othering of CEE capitalism in relation to capitalism as it exists in other geopolitical spaces. In addition to your third point, in what regards the gender perspective to be used in the political economy analysis, I would add that the racialization perspective should be also used, because patriarchy and racism together are endemic systems of capitalism, and the capitalist mode of production was always dependent not only on social reproduction and women's unpaid domestic work, but also on racialized cheap labor force. To conclude about the new crisis and its effects on neoliberal capitalism, again, I've read analyses that showed that there were some signs of economic recession even before the outbreak of the pandemic. And actually, the pandemic triggered the economic slump that already started before. We can also learn about some solutions to the critical stage, to the critical aspects of capitalism. I mean, they are not saying it like that, so the European Commission is not critical about capitalism, but we learned that even before the pandemic in 2019, the European Commission came out with the proposal of the Green New Deal, which means the planification and implementation of a green and digital transition. And this is a big open question if this transition will be just or will increase further inequalities and injustices. So what we learned from 2020 as a reaction to the pandemic is the flexibilization of fiscal surveillance from the side of European Commission. We can see how state aids are given to save the capital, but we know that these aids come mostly from loans, which result in the increase of public indebtedness, which at its turn has a negative impact on social policies, employment policies, income policies, and so on and so forth. So I think that, yeah, I totally agree with Dorothee's conclusion that neoliberalism is very resilient, but probably not only in our countries or in the semi-peripheries of Eastern Europe, or if it is more resilient here, maybe we should ask, why is this happening here in a way that supports global capitalism? So to reflect again on the role of Central and Eastern Europe on the stage of global capitalism. Nevertheless, yeah, we are faced here with the contradictory nature of changing neoliberal capitalism, which for sure will lead to the perpetuation of the current crisis and the outbreak of further crises. I already mentioned some of these contradictions, which is the intervention of the state to save the capital, but also the non-intervention of the state to save people and the labor force, and continue to appeal to people's responsibility to save their own destinies. And the term resilience is a new politicized term here in order to continue this trend. Two more things to add here as a conclusion. As part of the changing neoliberal capitalism is militarization, which is, I don't know, a sign for a new political restructuring on a global stage of capitalism. And it's also a profit-making opportunity for the relevant sector, armament sector. And also another aspect of changing neoliberal capitalism is, but it's not a new one, but maybe it's strengthened, and pandemic is used as a justification for further policing the state as a mean of control and disciplining the dispossessed who are continue to be victims of all sorts of inequalities as endemic features of capitalism. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Annika. I will also make a couple of points in response to Doro's presentation. And let me start by saying that I very much enjoyed this sort of very systematic overview of where we are now, particularly in relationship to scholarship, but in relationship to sort of, in a sense, the outliers, Poland and Hungary. And I want to raise 3 points of provocation, if you want. So we have a bit of debate going. Some of them sort of overlap with what Annika has said. And I want to raise these 3 points of provocation on actors, on causal mechanisms, and on blind spots as opposed to blind spot, as Doro put it. So let me start with the actors, right? And I come to this question of who are the capitalists in Doro's story. And it seems to me that, at least the way that I heard it, with a couple of exceptions, which were quite notable when Doro was discussing Hungary, with a couple of exceptions, there is a conflation, at least in the literature, of industrial capitalists and financial capitalists. And I'm wondering, what is it that we analytically gain by conflating or by erasing the specific patterns of financialization that we have had in Eastern Europe and that have morphed over time but are still very present? Particularly if I think about Doro's axis of inequality that she uses in order to create this typology of capitalisms. And if you want, just for me, a very simple indication of the importance of financial capitalists is the fact that institutional investors in Eastern Europe that manage our pension funds that are foreign owned, that manage our insurance companies are foreign owned, that manage most of our banking systems or foreign owned. And of course, there are political dynamics that come with that, but I'm wondering, what is it that we gain analytically by basically sort of merging them with industrial capitalists, or by not discussing them as a separate political force with their separate political agendas and points of mobilization, particularly when we think about, this occurred to me just now, when we think about the relationship between the state and and care work in general. Then on the trajectory, and this is something that the economist in me wants to understand a bit better, I suppose, and I'm wondering, how do we account for the historical trajectory that we see? I mean, what we have seen is a snapshot of where we are now, but I remember a long time ago when I wrote my PhD on the role of the Central Bank of Romania in the Romanian transition towards a market economy, I saw at play a lot of effort to sort of suppress and, in a sense, erase the ideas about developmentalism in the sort of intellectual elite early in the transition. And it would never have occurred to me that 20, 30 years later, I will hear about the return of the developmentalist state in Eastern Europe. And I want to understand what are the causal mechanisms that bring us there? What in Doro's analytical framework can help us understand why Poland and Hungary are back there with some specific, very important modifications, but how do we understand the return of the developmental state without understanding broader political dynamics to which I guess Eastern Europe is just sort of following instead of initiating. The third, on blind spots, and this touches to some extent on what Eniko has been saying, is, I mean, as a feminist, I think gender has to be brought into this picture. I'm wondering, in terms of the low carbon transition and climate, whether this is not something that has to be addressed in parallel, as opposed to having a gender focus, particularly if I think about the political and structural pressures that are coming from Brussels in terms of the recovery and resilience plans, in terms of the European Green Deal. I mean, if you want, even in the European Green Deal and the recovery and resilience plans, there is a political appeal to a more developmentalist approach and a more technocratic, the buildup of a technocratic capacity within the state. And here in Romania, we know, because our recovery and resilience plan has still not been approved or has been sent to Brussels. And to my mind, to some extent, because we don't have the technocratic capacity yet developed. So I would like to understand how this blind spot of the low carbon transition that I think will organize a lot of the political economy of Eastern Europe, particularly for member states of the European Union, how do we articulate the kind of questions that arise there, not only in terms of just transitions, which is very important, not only in terms of the return to the imaginary white working class man that needs to be protected against the progressive forces of intersectionality in some accounts, but also in terms of green industrial policy, which the Brussels seems to suggest it is something to be brought back on the table in very specific forms. Okay, I'll stop here and let me invite Doro to respond. And then I will take questions from the audience. You can put your hand up or you can type your question in the chat and I'll come to you. And remember gender balance. So I will invite both women and men to ask questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for all these comments. And in some sense, you give me an easy task because I do agree with basically most of what's been said. So I think partly my answers will be clarifications and partly also a little bit, how to say, maybe stressing where the perspective where I come from, which is comparative political economy, makes some of your of the sweeping claims a little bit more complicated. So I start with Eniko. So again, I very much, and I would very much like to get your slides. I like the way how you outline, you know, what is a study of 30 years of capitalist transformation in East Central Europe. So these 10 points, and I could not agree more. Where I think where a comparative perspective brings in some more nuances is in some of your later claims. So when you quote Roberts for, you know, there is no growth and salary have been stalled and so on, And they were saving across Eastern Europe in the last ever since the financial crisis. There is, of course, I would just say it is not entirely so simple. And then the question is always, do you look from the system or do you look from its parts, and how do you bring it together? And that's not an easy task. So just to give you just a couple of examples. So if you look at minimum wages, they have been actually growing in most countries, not in all of East Central Europe, quite dramatically. If you look at labor force participation, and not only in low-paid jobs, partly because so many people left, so you have, even the market has helped to bring wages up. So so if you look at real wage development, and if you compare to pre-financial crisis, you do see that actually most of the region was not doing all that bad. So the secular stagnation, clearly from a semi-peripheral point of view, looks a little bit different. Then then another, again, so and I think therefore, and this also leads me already a little bit to one of Gabriela's point, sorry, Daniela's point. This interest in developmentalism is, I think, partly because so many of us, observers, hope so much it would finally come back. But it is also coming back in some degree, at least, and so I think the Polish case is one of the case, and therefore the Polish case is so interesting. And the Polish case partly also contradicts it, partly, right? What you're saying that we have basically a full depletion of all the social sector and housing and evictions, and the hospital sector and so on. So if you followed a little bit the debate currently in Poland about the recovery plan, I mean, the government is basically putting a strong stress on taxing the rich and putting money into the hospital and care sector. So there is a change. And then Daniela, you were asking, so how can we understand this causally? So where does the change come from? And here I can basically, I certainly cannot give a general answer to this, because it's also not a general phenomenon. I think Poland stands out, but people in the audience might know much better than me how Hungary is certainly not a case of developmentalism. Let me put it this way. Romania is not a case of developmentalism, but Poland seems to be a case. And Lithuania apparently at one point also moved a little bit in that direction. So where does it come from? I mean, I retell the story as I understood it from Marek Nacek, but he basically said, and here we come to the interesting story of financialization of the financial sector. So it is the management, the Polish management of foreign-owned banks that realized at one point that basically they face a glass ceiling, and that there is no way of upgrading the Polish financial sector, but then also the industrial sector, if we don't get out of dependency. And they basically, in alliance with and partly in moving over to state positions, were at the origin of indeed a more developmentalist way of thinking about the economy. And they had, I mean, if you recall a little bit the Polish trajectory, there was always, I think, more statism and less. I mean, it was less. Compared to Romania, it was less radical, right, in neoliberalism, and you had always pockets of alternative thinking. And I guess, so you get economic actors, and interestingly from the financial sector, pushing for a more developmentalist direction, and you get actors in the state apparatus, and this is not only peace, this started under the PO government, so the previous Liberal government basically implementing a slightly more developmentalist agenda. And you see it now in a number of areas happening. So, which also means that foreign dependency is not a curse, and this brings, not necessarily a curse. And this brings me to another point that, let me say that I forgot. Yeah, I think it is Daniela who raised this. So the broader political dynamic, and you were saying just like this, yeah, because the East is following and not initiating. No, I don't know about that. And I'm never so I think there's a lot of experimentation going on in the region. And if you read earlier work by, I think it's Bogman and Eyal, if I remember well, who basically also for neoliberalism have shown how actually think tanks and intellectuals and so on in the region have contributed to building up what became a global paradigm. And a similar thing might or might not be at stake at the moment as well, exactly because these countries had such a special role in global capitalism, right? So what came together is the transformation of socialism and the height of neoliberal global capitalism. And this in Europe, where basically European economies or economic actors could basically use this as their playground to practice internationalization, because this is in a way what has happened, right? So if Eastern Europe was at the forefront of these hyper neoliberal developmental model, as Vera Stepanovic calls it, I would not find it surprising that you also have a backlash and a backlash thinking in many ways of what to, how to get out of what is called the middle income trap, for instance. Now, if we take the Polish example, I just told you what I remember from Marit Nacik's work, but let's take Hungary. Now here you have just a very different alliance. So here you have basically also the domestic bourgeoisie, but the petty bourgeoisie, right? So so a lot of shop owners, but also maybe the media sector and some sectors that were never, that lived kind of on and off from foreign direct investment, but it doesn't have its own kind of industrial or and also even in that sense financial base. So you have the alliance of the Orbanites with the petty bourgeoisie, and that brings out a kind of anti-developmental coalition. Right, so that would be, so if you want to ask me for the causal mechanisms, I would probably, and here I follow the work that many people now in comparative political economy do, look at coalitions between different actors and what comes as the outcome. Maybe I don't want to spend too much time, but the ones Two points I want to raise. So first of all, yes, I agree with Anneke and Daniela. The blind spots are more. So racism is clearly, and the green economy or low carbon economy is one of the major things. And I don't have much to say on it. I just don't know enough. What I know partly from your work, Daniela, partly from Cornel Bahn's work. So you started to work on this a little bit. I think, if I had the depth of analytical, and breadth of analytical capacity, I don't know whether you have seen Nancy Fraser's recent work on cannibal capitalism, I think, something like that it's called. So where she basically outlines a way how to think about, and it builds on the earlier work. So bits and pieces have been published over the last years, and it's a kind of summary. But what she basically kind of looks at capitalism as being embedded in a kind of Polanyian sense in 4 sets of relations: the relation with nature, the relation with state, the relation with care, and the relation of exploitation with work. But what she also says that each of these, so what is, I think, interesting about her approach is to say that each of these spheres have their own normativity, they have their own actors, they have their own kind of moral logic. And what the dynamic of capitalism basically explains itself by what she calls boundary struggle. So how much of, let's say, emancipatory green economy do you get into capitalism versus how much the more market-based carbon trading economy you push into the into the, you know, the nature sphere. So, and these boundary struggles, and you have it in all four struggles, right? So it's so with the care work also. So how much of basically either marketization or traditional, I mean, in terms of this care fair, or how much emancipation do you get as a compromise and a conflict over these boundaries? And this, and you take also, so she would, what I now put into the foreground, the relationship between political authority and the economy. More broadly speaking, she would say this is just one of the boundary struggles, right? So how much state actors and states and markets, if you want, how much who takes how much, so to speak. And I think this is a very productive way of thinking about this. But if you want to do it empirically and systematically and then comparatively, it's also a very, very challenging project to do it. But I mean, ideally, kind of, you know, this is I think yeah, I repeat myself, it's a very productive way of thinking about this. And I think I leave it at this because probably there are more questions and I don't want to talk too long, rather hear more comments and questions.
Great, thank you. Well, we might return